All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, and I am stoked to have this guest on for the first time. He is Amazon's best-selling author in the category that I forgot, but you'll know pretty quickly because it's a great book. We're going to be spending a ton of time talking about it today. I have with me the great Michael Flem joining us to talk about his book, Visions of Atlantis. Michael, welcome to the show, man. Your book is excellent. I read it. I really liked it. I like the direction you took with the material. But before we get to that, tell the audience a little bit about yourself. Tell the audience maybe what brought you to write such an awesome book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's always weird when, you spend 7 years writing and researching a book and then, a complete stranger tells you they enjoyed it. It's a weird feeling. I still don't take it for granted. So I really appreciate that. But, I was just a regular, you know, adjunct professor of history and philosophy for about 13 years in Chicago at different universities. And I guess about 8 years ago, I was in a bookstore and I stumbled upon The Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly. And, like most people, I was familiar kind of tangentially with the idea of Atlantis or a lost civilization before the time of the Ice Age. And but when I read that book, I was really shocked at how not just sophisticated his 19th century analysis was. Writing just a few years after they even discovered the mid-Atlantic ridge, and for him to put together the kind of story that he put together, albeit incomplete because of just the limitations of his own time. I thought, this is interesting. And it got me reading other books, which led me inevitably to looking at, well, what did some remote viewers and clairvoyants say about this topic? And, I was a pretty, I'm not going to say skeptical materialist type person. I mean, I've been on both sides of the debate. I have a lot of respect for religious people, spiritual people, but I also, professionally from my master's degree studied, critiques of religion and the Enlightenment, and had one ready to go for any of my friends in my early 20s. So I could kind of see it from both angles, and I wanted to write a book that, explained, like, instead of just saying Edgar Cayce or another, clairvoyant said the following, I really wanted to show, well, what did contemporaries of these people who lived with them, or in the case of Edgar Cayce, who's probably the most studied and documented psychic in probably the world, if I had to guess, with 15,000 typewritten transcripts of all his readings, affidavits, medical professionals studying him while he's in a trance state, and then corroborating evidence, because the majority of his 15,000 readings have nothing to do with Atlantis. They have to do with medical readings, finding mineral deposits, missing persons, things like this. And I really wanted to show, kind of like in a mini biographical way, the origins of, clairvoyant visions, if you will, of this subject, and focus on the first people who really used that ability, and, touch on a few of the later clairvoyants who maybe could have been influenced by, say, movies, popular culture. But I wanted to see who were the first people to ever talk about this subject. And then let's go also back to from pre-Platonic sources to today, and kind of show people, before you get to the clairvoyant evidence, probably halfway through the book, chapter 2, what does the historical record itself say? And then what took me so long was just piecing together where that evidence actually linked up with more esoteric evidence. And then also adding, where do new archaeological discoveries, oceanographic discoveries, cultural things that people might not have noticed, where do they all point? And to my great surprise, over time, like a very coherent vision, if you will, of this ancient culture emerged. It was just very difficult to piece together because I had to go through, 7 or 8 different professional fields and become kind of like a amateur expert in, oceanography for 2 years to really see, okay, is this a legitimate, bathythermic scan, and, call an oceanographic institute and say like, hey, is this really true? Did you really find this at this time? And, interview a few witnesses of strange objects that were found in strange places. And so what emerged was really, at the same time, a historiography, I guess, as we would call it in the professional field, like how the history itself was written, because it changes, as you know, over time. The history of World War II is very different after the war than it was in the 70s than it is today. We look at things as time goes on very differently. And it was definitely the case with a subject that's at least 2,400 years old. If you go back to Plato in his, dialogues, that's a long time. And I wanted to show people how, not just how the majority of people thought it was real and still think it's real. And there's a handful of these, ideological debunkers who claim to, be more intelligent than Plato, Michel de Montaigne, Francis Bacon. That's a pretty tall order. You can be smarter than me, that's fine, but we should probably pay attention to the ancients who built civilization when they say that this was real and that it was destroyed in a cataclysm. And I think the kind of strength of the book was, that I never really told people what to think. I really detest authors who have a strong conviction about anything. I've never liked authors that tell you from page one, Atlantis was true, and let me show you. I really took a very skeptical approach, and I said, look, when I write this, if it turns out to all just be, an allegory or mythological story, that's fine. It'll still make for a great book, to show how that myth evolved. But to my great surprise, there actually was an overabundance of evidence suggesting that this indeed was real and was utterly destroyed, at the end of the last ice age, as Graham Hancock and many others have, proposed. So that's the kind of, I guess, impetus for why I wanted to do it. But yeah, I guess there you go. That answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And it gives me a great opportunity to share my impetus for reading and finding your book outside of hosting a podcast where I talk to interesting folks like yourself. You might be aware, anybody who's on social media or YouTube has probably seen these videos. There's a growing contingency of people talking about this old world. It borders on hysteria and sensationalism, and the World's Fair were a complete, cover up of this vastly forgotten
yes,
civilization.
Tartaria.
And I just was crusading in the sense, not against it because I'm, against open-minded thought. I think it's fascinating, to be honest, but
Sure.
As a fellow New Englander, you can relate. We're from a place where there's 400 more years of written history and buildings, construction, records, and things like that. So I just really immediately got red flags and alarm bells when I started seeing the Tartaria thing. And I started looking.
It's so funny.
Go ahead.
It's so funny. And I don't mean to interrupt. It's so funny because you're one of the first people in many interviews I've done to bring up that. And it's so funny because I was just talking about this with a friend, and the importance of, good scholarship. And I have a friend who, he's a great person, open-minded person. And I said, just be careful because there's this whole other generation. I call them like TikTok historians, and it's very easy to crowbar like you said, a tunnel under a temple, and then and I've said for many times, if mud flood didn't rhyme, I feel like the entire movement would lose impetus. I feel like that's like 90% of the appeal is mud, like the
Oh,
actual like rhyme of the word, because it's actually much more likely that what we're talking about, which is a cataclysmic comet strike or similar catastrophe, for which there's a lot of evidence, and not just evidence, there's a lot of cultural stories that describe that. The Egyptians themselves said that, and they identified the date, of
right.
the end of the last ice age accurately in the year 360, or actually in the year 560 BC, roughly, when Solon got the story. So it's like, when people look at newspapers from 1901 and they say, well, this is when the reset took place because, mud was falling in New Zealand. It's like, I mean, maybe there was a mud flood or local thing, but it's like the whole World's Fair and this and that. It's really funny you said that because I think people will be surprised as a person who wrote a book on clairvoyant visions of Atlantis that I have extreme doubts about night
Well, and if I could
mud
just,
flood phenomenon.
I'm with you, and it's a big reason why I wanted to talk to you about this. And maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist more than I am an ancient historian, but I thought as I started learning more and more about Tartaria that this must be some sort of attempt at co-opting this new movement. And it's not that new, but it's gaining
Sure.
steam, especially with folks like Graham Hancock, love him or hate him.
Right.
It's
Right.
gaining steam, and people are turning their attention towards the old world more than ever before. And
Yeah.
particularly here in America, there's been a cover up of things like mounds, the
Yep.
advancement of indigenous cultures, and their connection to this ancient culture that fell victim to a cataclysm. So it's almost like
Right.
they're erasing all this time in between and saying, no, 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 the cataclysm happened only a couple hundred years ago. Forget everything else. It's all made by the
Right.
devil, or it's all made by the
Right.
Masons. And it's like,
Right.
what are we talking about here, folks? There's this whole history to be uncovered of Atlantis, Lemuria, and beyond. Maybe
Yeah.
Tartaria existed in Russia, but as far as America goes, I think the
Right. Well,
conversation needs
and
to be
that's the
Atlantis.
well, and that's the thing. It's like I told my friend, I said the idea that the Tartars, who I learned about in mainstream Russian history class, like the Tartars, the Cossacks, the Alans, like all these steppe tribes, it's like no one's disputing that there was a region called Tartaria, just like there was a region called Khazaria where Ukraine is. Like nobody's debating that, but it's like, what the hell does finding a tunnel under a building in Seattle have to do with the Tartarian steppe plains of Russia? I still am confused about that. And, what would cause, not to waste any more of your listeners' time, but it's like, what would cause the mud? It would have to be a cataclysm on par with what documented, historical records say took place 12,000 years ago. It's not like, oh, they had electricity and this church was actually a power plant. It's like, okay, well, how come Ben Franklin didn't know that then?
Right, right.
I mean, really, like, like, there's, I just read a biography of Ben Franklin. It's like, so if he was living concurrently with Tartaria, why did he have to do electrical experiments then?
Yeah.
Like it's like if they could send telegrams from London to New York and Philly, it's like, then why did it take them, a month to learn that the Revolutionary War was breaking out? If we were indeed in Tartarian times, it's like
Right.
that's almost just as silly as people to me who categorically deny the possibility of an antediluvian civilization, because
Right.
we don't have any evidence, which is absurd, and I always use the example of, Troy. Like people for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years believed the city of Troy was, a fictional city, that the Trojan War never happened. It was just a Greek, tragedy. And, And then they dug it up, and then they found King Priam's tomb, and it's like, okay. And then somebody said, when, of course, Graham Hancock became quite popular in the mid 90s, oh, this is just a bunch of horse shit. There's no evidence. And then, Gobekli Tepe gets dug up, and it's exactly the date he puts and other ancient, sources put for the end of this cataclysmic age. And it's like, then they find Gunung Padang, and it's possibly 27,000 years old, and on and on and on. And I think, I'm not sure. It could be. I mean, there's evidence that what's his name, the MK Ultra programmer Aquino, a Satanist in the 80s, was tasked, according to one anecdotal. I think there is a declassified record that can prove this, that he was tasked with seeing how many people you can convince of the flat Earth theory. That there is some anecdotal evidence that the CIA was interested in seeing how populations could believe something that they ordinarily wouldn't.
Wow.
So I think you might be right. There might be some sort of, whether it's an organic movement from, like I call the TikTok school of history, or if it's something more nefarious, like let's really muddle the waters with the mud flood so that all legitimate inquiry is just kind of made silly. But yeah, and I don't even address that in the book, even in the section on the critics of this. I really tried to focus on just a kind of taking readers on a kind of story from, well, who talked about this before Plato? What did Plato say? Because very few people read those dialogues. They just read a Wikipedia entry that says what Plato said. But if you really read it, it's not at all written like any other Greek mythological story. It's not allegorical. And he disclaims the story by saying, every word of this is true. And it's vouched for by Solon, who is a real person. And of course, the story comes from, Egypt, which is important because it was the Egyptians at the temple of Sais that told Solon around the year 560, let's say, in his middle age, look, there's this story that we've preserved as the inheritors of this event that you Greeks don't know about, because we write things in stone and you don't. And so when bad things happen, you have to come to us. That's what they say.
Right.
And so that's what Solon was doing there. And so when people say, well, what does the Giza plateau have to do with Atlantis? It's like the story of Atlantis comes from Egypt. The Greeks transmitted it to the West, but it doesn't originate in Greece. So right off the bat, logically, there's too much chain of custody to just claim Plato invented it and he created a very convenient backstory. Right. Because let's presume he did that. Well, then we have a problem, because Plato put the date at 9600 BC, which mainstream science would basically date plus or minus, let's say, 200 years as the beginning of the end of the Ice Age and the Holocene period. So how did he know in 360 BC, when Plato wrote his dialogues, that the Ice Age ended in 9600 BC, and that it was precipitated by a heavenly body that fell to earth and burned everything upon it? That's a hell of a guess for an allegory.
Yeah. Right.
And so right there, I tell people, like, let's just cut through this bullshit that he made this up, because he made two guesses that are frankly impossible. And so it was with Edgar Cayce and other clairvoyants who made these, at the time, 1930s, wild claims that people were like, the pyramid was built in 10,390. Like, what are you talking about? But then it's like, you get to the 90s and the 80s, and it's like, well, you've got Robert Bauval's theory or hypothesis that if you look at the precessional alignment, where do the three pyramids line up with the constellation Orion? 10,450 BC. It's like, oh, that's a good guess, Mr. Cayce, who had a sixth grade education, no working knowledge while he wasn't in trance of Egyptology or any historical subject. That's a hell of a guess.
Well, and also,
you know what?
And
I was just going to say, you know what else is a great guess? Edgar Cayce in 1932 said, there used to be a river system that originated at the Nile, crisscrossed through Central Africa, was as large as the Amazon, and emptied into the Atlantic Ocean near the Congo end of the country. That's what Edgar Casey said. Now, people probably just filed that away and were like, well, whatever, you know, well, okay, sure, Mr. Casey. Well, in 1986, space shuttle imaging radar determined there's an enormous Amazon River sized, subterranean river that had its origin at the Nile headwaters and emptied into the Atlantic Ocean near Cameroon. And it's like, okay, that's an important data point, not to mention the thousands of medical readings where he could diagnose Mark without seeing Mark. And then Mark would go to an actual oncologist and they would find the tumor exactly where this man in a trance said it was, which lends validity to his, other claims. And not to mention that Harvard, Stanford, Princeton all sent medical psychiatrists and doctors to analyze this man. And all of them were trying actively to debunk him. And they all had to admit, we actually do not understand this, but this man has an ability to non-locally perceive things with a 95% accuracy rate. And it's like, okay, that's a channeler I'm interested in using instead of a TikToker that says, I had a past life in Atlantis, which to me is not invalid. It's just, I wanted to show people that, non-local forms of perception were legitimate. You could go to Stanford and get a degree in it right now with Dean Radin at the Department of Noetics. It's provable.
Right.
It's just you have to be very careful how you use these sources. I just use them to fill in and add what I call, the visions, like a snapshot, because some of these clairvoyants provide images of the reality in like HD color of what it would have been like to live there. Whereas Plato and others, they paint a rough picture of the dimensions of the city, let's say, or the landmass or the culture, but they don't provide like a vivid image of exactly what, let's say, politics were like and what people were wearing and what the drama and the language was like. For that, I had to go to the clairvoyance, and it became just its own kind of beast after that, that really just obsessed me. And I became so fascinated in seeing just, how believable this was.
Yeah.
Without any fantastical elements, like explanations in natural sciences for what we would consider magical or fantastical things. It's just a more advanced physics, a more advanced chemistry, levitational technology to, reverse the
now more
weight
than
of
ever,
objects.
people are warmed up and open to these ideas, and I think the notion that someone like Edgar Casey could bring forth actual evidence and factual information from this non-local sort of perception, it's slowly becoming, as you pointed out, something that major schools are giving degrees in. But to bring it back to our quick little Tartaria tangent and how I kind of stumbled upon your work, I was almost like motivated to really look into what was hidden when I started seeing a lot of these Tartaria posts. People would show photographs and say, look at this photograph, yada, yada, yada. And what I found really interesting is when I went on and did my own research, there are all these stone structures that nobody talks about. They don't talk about them in these photographs. One is the background of my computer home screen, and it's one that I found. I've never seen it in any books, but it's a stone shaped like a giant bird, and it's oriented towards the west on the equinoxial line so that it aligns with the equinox, summer or spring or fall. Is that the solstice? Am I getting those two confused? Either way, it's I always do that. It's aligned, and it's just one of many megaliths that have gone pretty much ignored. A Dighton Rock, the Newport Tower, the chambers, the stone chambers. So I started thinking, like, where do these fit into the larger picture? There's obviously correlative evidence in other parts of the world. Asia, Europe has evidence of these types of
Sure.
structures. And I thought to myself, well, if Atlantis was this culture that was destroyed, the diaspora would have spread out in a circle away from the Atlantic Ocean or the Atlantic center where Atlantis theoretically was. And go figure,
Sure.
you have all this evidence for a similar kind of culture, at least in the form of the stone structures. So that made me think, could Francis Bacon, writing New Atlantis, and these other guys of his
Mm.
time period have had foreknowledge of what they were going to find when they hit the East Coast? You know, it's a
Well,
little bit.
that's really interesting. That you know what you just said there, because when the conquistadors, from Spain and Portugal, and later the English and other Europeans started to get to North America, that really in the book, as I kind of show the chronology of like, the story of Atlantis, kind of like everything learned, kind of fell into decline at the end of the Roman Empire, Dark Ages, and then it really got picked up again during this age of exploration because they started to think like, is this that place Plato was talking about? And in a weird way, that was the most difficult chapter to write because they were correct and they were incorrect. And I guess the best way to explain that without spending like 2 hours is this. I just take it on faith, but I'll explain why I think that having through way of a story he got from the Egyptians through Solon, what I would call the final destruction, when Atlantis, the culture, was reduced to a large and then two smaller islands where I would argue the Azores basin is. And I have a very good reason for saying that. But he also says that. He says in front of the Straits of Gibraltar. So most people think, well, that's the only source that talks about Atlantis. So that's the whole story. But as Edgar Cayce explained, this culture, which he also put as being destroyed in a final cataclysm around 10,000 BC, it itself had actually endured for almost 80,000 years before that. And so the default state of humanity, contrary to our timeline, was Atlantis. That actually we are a weird aberration on the timeline. Because according to Edgar Cayce, it wasn't always, think about how different our culture has been in the last 200 years. Like if somebody asked in the future, what was America like from beginning to end? It's like, oh, they walked around with horses and muskets. Or it's like, no, I heard they had rockets that landed. That's in, 250 years we've achieved that. Imagine if a culture on some even like theoretical level, geographically, had been inhabitants for 80,000 years on what Cayce said was at first basically what we call today the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is still the largest mountain range in the world. It's just underwater now. But if you raise sea levels 1,000 or you lower sea levels 1,000 feet, a lot of that is a continent that would be exposed. Just like the Caribbean would have been basically a landlocked area around Cuba. You can actually see a trace of a land bridge. And of course, they found a sunken city off the coast of Cuba 20 years ago that just nobody talks about. So for Cayce, it was basically like a primordial place that the origins of civilization, contrary to what we would believe would beginning in the Middle East, let's say in Sumer and Ur and this kind of thing. Cayce said actually there were 5 kind of explosions of civilization in different regions of the world that created basically the 5 races, roughly speaking. And he said the red race, using the terms of the 1930s, Native Americans, and he specifically identified the Iroquois as descendants of the original Atlantean race. He said the red race incarnated on this continent that stretched basically from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Portugal, And he said because of two huge destructions, one at 50,000 BC, one at 28,000 BC. So you're talking enormous time spans. That larger continent was eventually fractured into 5 islands that were huge, and then finally 3 by the time post 28,000 BC. So the story Plato's telling is the third version or iteration of this vastly ancient culture that probably changed races, changed hands, changed. I mean, how many governments did they have in 80,000 years, if that's even possible? So I just try to focus on like, well, if you take the final iteration, the famous one of the island of Atlantis, which is still a large island, twice as big, say, as England, depending on how you interpret Plato's account. But I could show you what I think is the remnant of it at the bottom of the Azores Basin, and it's about twice the size of England. A lot of people were like, maybe this is Atlantis when they found North America, and one famous Spanish Jesuit, or he wasn't a Jesuit, actually, that's a different one, but one famous Spanish author who wrote the history of the Indies and the Spanish conquest, Gomara, he thought that, like, we've come to Mexico and they strangely have these words that we can't explain in the Yucatan, like atl, and he's like, that's half of Atlantis. And he was correct in that. But it wasn't that he had found Atlantis, he had found a diasporic offshoot. Because in Edgar Casey's account, they actually had foreknowledge through a variety of means that you can read about in the book of this impending catastrophe. And Casey said they went 3 places primarily. And this wasn't just like the day of when the comet's in the air, like, let's get in the canoe. This was like hundreds of years before. They went to Giza and they built the pyramid as a final redoubt against a coming catastrophe. That's what Edgar Casey said. And actually what medieval Arabic accounts that people discredit say, that there's zero chance Edgar Casey could even get in translation in 1932, that are hard for me to find.
Well, not to mention Edgar Casey was someone who was devoutly Christian, and
Right.
probably the Bible was the most books he'd read. I don't know if he probably read a lot of medical stuff after.
No, he didn't.
Wow.
In fact, I read as all the biographies I could find of him, and according to all witnesses and his family, when one doctor searched his house, the only books he found
anything,
were
right?
romance novels and the Bible and the newspaper.
Right. Okay, that's what it was. And I remember you wrote about this
Plato.
Strict German doctor who was like, "No, I will find Casey. He is a liar."
Hugo Munsterberg from Harvard.
Yes.
He took a trip on a train, in the 1920s, all the way out to Hopkinsville. And he said, there's been all too much written about you, because the New York Times was writing front page articles about this man who could cure people without seeing them. And, that was a newspaper of record. It's not like the New York Times today, the newspaper propaganda. If something came out in 1920 in the New York Times, like, their fact checking was quite serious. And so Casey was on the front page, and Munsterberg at Harvard was a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And he's like, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to find a bunch of bookmarked medical almanacs, and there's some sort of sleight of hand. And he lived with him. And then he met up with this other guy, Dr. Ketchum, who was I think a Stanford or Princeton doctor, who was living with Casey in the same town, because he's like, I use this guy to cure some patients that I can't even cure. And he has a 99% accuracy rate. And so Munsterberg interviewed Ketchum, and he's like, no, look, this is true. I didn't believe it either, but this guy is actually doing this. And this Atlantis topic didn't come out until like halfway through Casey's career, where people started asking him about certain like psychological conditions. And he'd say, well, this is a result of this thing you did in your past life in Rome, or this is a result of a betrayal you experienced in the third destruction of Atlantis. And people were like, what are you talking about? But then certain people started to really press him like they would get a group together, people like you and me, and he would go into this hypnagogic trance on his couch, which took a long time. And then his heart rate would slow to near coma rate. And then his voice would kind of change. And he would say, ready for questions. And you had to be very careful how you brought him out of the coma like state because he could die, you know? So he had to be medically supervised on the way in and on the way out. And in his own explanation, that was his way of accessing what he called the superconscious mind or the Akashic records.
Right.
And Akasha in Sanskrit, I think it's interesting because Akasha in Sanskrit means ether. So it's almost like the cosmic, Ethernet, which he claimed was a kind of permanent record. Some people have suggested it's the Van Allen belts or this or that. I don't know.
And this kind of takes us to a good point to pause for a moment because, a lot of people, especially getting into this realm of newer alternative thought, they're like, well, how can everything just fit so well together? Like, it's all like too good to be true. And, the conspiracy theory community, for worse or for better, was very much populated by Christian dominant ideations, and that has cast a lot of doubt on the New Age or the pagan or the metaphysical, right? And I think it's kind of interesting to take that out of it, looking at Casey, someone who existed before that kind of culture blossomed, and think about how, from this lens, these pieces of spirituality and metaphysical information are actually leftovers from this Atlantean cataclysm, and that's why they're found in different cultures, but they resemble each other. It's not that, it's just all too good to be true. It's that there's a story, an origin, a common origin that these ideas share that we have been either made to forgot or accidentally forgot. I tend to think it's more of a process of being made to forgot, and that kind of goes back to this point we were just making about the Atlantean diaspora and the settlers, for lack of a better term, of the New World, the conquistadors and them. They had this idea of what they were finding, and it's contributed to this suppression of things like mounds, what's been found in the mounds, megaliths that don't fit into the sort of accepted, explanations. So this bigger picture is starting to build here. And Ignatius Donnelly, I'm glad we brought him up at the beginning, because he's someone who, I believe Henry O'Brien also is someone around this time period who had an Irish descent, and they were kind of finding connections between Ireland and Atlantis. The Tuatha De Danann are talked a lot about in this respect. Now you're telling me the Iroquois have a connection. It's not far-fetched at all, considering there's actually common origins between the Algonquin languages and the Celtic languages. There's a common linguistic origin.
That's interesting. I actually didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, and what I did is basically, and that's very well said, because I think that is the main confusion that I was really trying to, and again, it's no offense to people that are obsessed with, say, like the reshot structure, because it's a shiny object that looks quite superficial. And I talk about it in the book, quite superficially, like the circular city capital. But people are still stuck in this, like, where's the circular city? And it's like, even in, like, forget the clairvoyant evidence. Let's look exactly at what Plato said. Plato said it was a subcontinental island that had dominion over the other islands around it, confirmed by Casey, that from which you could traverse the ocean, which was navigable, and reach the whole of the opposite continent on the other side of the true ocean. So how the hell did the ancient Greeks, by way of Egypt, know about North America? Well, again, look through, one thing I should say that I never made into the book is, when people say there's a lot of evidence, like of Phoenician colonization in Brazil thousands of years ago in the Bronze Age, The Romans burned, when they burned Carthage, they burned the library to the ground. So all the records of Phoenician travel are gone, or they're in the Vatican, but they're gone for
Right.
us.
And the Great
So,
Lakes too. There's Carthaginian or Phoenician like
or
sacrificial
Atlantean,
altar stones in the Great Lakes.
or Atlantean. And
Right.
actually, I've got an interesting take on that, on the 3,000 mines of copper that disappeared into thin air in the Great Lakes, in the Lake Superior region. Yeah. But, like you said, it's like, well, it's not like like Ignatius Donnelly. There's a quote. I wish I had it pulled up, but he says it so well. He goes, look at it. If you Google, or if you go through the book and use the search function for "look at it," and it's such a beautiful quote. He's like, an Atlas mountain at the mouth of the Mediterranean. An Aztec people that come from Atlan, an Atlantic Ocean. You know what I mean? He's like, how much more do you need to look at this and say, like, hey, maybe linguistically these are actually all remnant cultures?
Right.
And what Casey and the clairvoyants did was not just tie it all together in a way that I couldn't do without their evidence, but they added the kind of substantiation to certain claims that these groups of people were in possession of high technology.
Right.
Because as a historian, like, I'm aware of the critique of, well, how where are you getting this high technology, flying machines and all of this, as applies to Atlantis? And the key to that was Casey, but also a person that came before Edgar Casey, which is the weirdest source in the book, the Frederick Oliver, who's a 17-year-old kid living on the California frontier in 1881, who himself was not an Egyptologist, an expert in any of these subjects. He was a 17-year-old miner living under Mount Shasta who claimed to have been told through clairaudience to write another person's past life in the year 11,160 BC on the principal Atlantean island of Poseid.
Yeah.
And it becomes a 400-page book that's never published in his lifetime, called A Dweller on Two Planets, that he never made money off, that kind of ruined his own reputation in town. People thought he was a weirdo. His family thought he was weird. He gained nothing from it. And yet, again, when most people talk about that book, they've never read it. I read that book 10 times, every word of it 10 times, to make sure everything I said about that. And, it has like a whole chapter in my book, because if you read his account of what life was like in 11,160 BC, and then you follow how he describes basically this same plot as the feature franchise Star Wars. The only problem is it's 90 years before the franchise was created, and he's talking
And
about,
at least a couple decades before sci-fi is even really a thing. I mean, some
yeah. And I
sci-fi
had a
authors were
guy,
alive, but they weren't really writing
no,
that kind
and
of stuff yet.
I had a guy, some asshole on Facebook, and I never engage with these people unless, they're polite with me, but just some complete moron who was like, yeah, but I mean, obviously he's copying Jules Verne. And I was like, show me where in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, theoretical Atlantean physics is described that's internally coherent. Show me where, the chemistry and the mining process in the Lake Superior Great Lakes region using Atlantean drills was described in it. Like,
Well,
get
not
out of
just
here.
that. I mean, I'm so glad you did read that book as many times as you did, because I also have a Dweller on Two Planets, and it
It's
was
a
like
weird book.
weird. And when I first saw it, I was kind of like, what is going on in this book? I didn't even
Yeah,
buy it at first because it was so indecipherable. But
it
one
is.
of the things that you pulled forth out of that is the amazing predictions, if you could call them that, because he wasn't necessarily predicting anything,
Right.
but just the way technology is being described in his time period eerily resembles what we
Yes.
have now. One great example that
Right.
everyone knows is a cell phone. He talks about
Yeah,
cell phones in
he
other
does.
words, right? How does he describe this
Smartphones.
device? Yeah,
No, and it's not even sell like he doesn't he skips like the Razor and the flip phone and
right,
goes straight to like iPhone 10.
right. They're
And he
already
calls them
holographic.
yeah, and he calls it a name, NAIM.
Hmm.
Because and he what's weird is that in the beginning of the book, whoever he's channeling, this person called Philos, that's using this 19th century boy to tell his story, he has a glossary of all the terms in the book. And a lot of people just kind of skip over that. But what's really weird is if you look at the words he used to describe the university or the flying machines or the cell phones or just the general words, there's like 80 Atlantean language words that he, or Poseidian words from that island that he uses. And, you know, if you compare those words to words from Yucatec or Basque, which are separated by the Atlantic Ocean, you know, the Pyrenees Mountains region and the Yucatan, both of which were places, along with Giza, that Edgar Casey specifically said the Atlanteans fled before and during the destruction. Then it becomes really eerie, you know, because he has names for people like Zaelm, Mainin, Lolix, Anzime. And so I went to the Center of Basque Studies and I looked at like a modern list and older lists of like first names in the Basque language from the Basque country. And they're like, he's using Basque names, but it's like he didn't have a Basque dictionary in
Right.
1881 in Mount Shasta, California. It's like, you know what I mean? And so, and then there are other similarities too, like even his description of there's a sentence that's quite interesting. And I title one of the chapters over this. And he's describing the Atlantean science, which is twinned with its philosophy and religion, because they follow what they call the law of one, not the New Age law of one, but the idea of like almost like hermetic correspondence, but like different. And basically, he said, there was this phrase called Axte Inkal Axtuke Mun. And you go, okay, well, what the hell does that mean? And he translates it and he says, you know, to understand Inkal is to understand all things, whatever. And you go, well, what's Inkal? Well, Inkal was the sun, the physical sun for them, which was their god. But it wasn't like a deity, like a anthropomorphized, you know, deity. It was like, no, that thing is a conscious being that gives life and evolution to all things on earth. And he explains like how that works. And it's like, it's so beyond the ability of a 17-year-old kid to make up an internal language that has parity with like extant languages that Edgar Casey himself said were remnant of the Atlantean primordial language, that you just go like, look, the only people that would think this is made up are like, if you treated this as anything else, you know, like if you just move this timeline from the scary 10,000 years ago, that's too long, to like ancient Greece, people would be like, wow, these clairvoyants really work because they piece together an ancient Doric language and, you know, Smithsonian exhibit on Edgar Casey. But because they're talking about a time that is utterly lost because of the rate of decay, you know, of all these materials except for megalithic structures, I think that's the part that just goes over people's heads, because they can't imagine that in 14,000 years from today, there likely will be no trace of this conversation, you, me, America, or anything that we've achieved right now, because we don't even store things in physical stone monuments,
Well,
except like the Hoover Dam has a star map of its
right.
date of construction. So in 14,000 years, maybe somebody might find that and go like, oh, like they were primitive people that like built a dam, I guess. But
Have you ever
there's going to
heard
be no
of
records of this.
Have you ever heard of the Clock Mountain? I don't know its full
Mm-mm.
official name. So apparently, I think Jeff Bezos is like the key funder of this
Mm.
idea. But they're essentially coring out the inside of a mountain and putting a giant clock inside of it, and it's essentially
Oh,
going to be this like thing that exists for theoretically millions of years and holds
that's cool.
information about humanity. Obviously, people are like, "Oh, Jeff Bezos is doing it." I don't know, but right after
Hey,
the
you know
Georgia
what though?
Guidestones get blown up,
I gotta say, I always say until I've met somebody, I don't
right?
talk shit about them. And to be honest, without Jeff Bezos and Amazon, I wouldn't have been able to self-publish a best-selling book. Really, I mean,
No,
I gotta give him credit for that.
yeah, it's one
You
of the
know,
unique ironies of our time, and I talk about it on the show because some authors are like, "Yeah, don't buy
yeah.
my book on Amazon, buy it from my website," and other authors are like, "No, Amazon's helped me incredibly," and they're
Well,
so grateful.
I'll tell you straight up. I had two literary agents. They shopped it to 20 publishers, both of them competing against each other. All the publishers said, these kinds of books don't sell. Nobody cares about this anymore.
Yeah, okay.
And if we do contract with you, we'll give you $1 per $22 book you sell.
Jeez.
So it's like,
Yeah.
who's the evil corporation in this? Like Random House, Penguin, or is it Jeff Bezos because he, got jacked up and has $1 billion and is kind of creepy, I'll admit. But I mean, look, everything has a double-edged sword, and I
Yeah.
think
Well, and he's a
just for
man behind in front of this huge machine, right? So it's like, blaming Napoleon for it's like they're not it's the way civilizations move, in these grand steps. So, but I
but
not go ahead.
well, that's really interesting though, because it reminds me of another subplot that I don't spend too much time on, but for those familiar with the Edgar Casey ancient history readings, he claims the Atlanteans themselves did exactly what you just said, that they created three halls of records or three sets of records that they placed in a principal hall in Giza underneath what he claimed was between the Nile River and the Sphinx, accessed via a tunnel under the Sphinx. And then in other parts, one in Yucatan and one, it's hard to say. Some people say Bahamas, some people say the reading really suggests the Azores, that there's a temple down there. But in any case, he said that because somebody said to him, "How can we prove this? Beyond the shadow of a doubt, in case like nobody believes you in the future from your transcripts and stuff. Like, do you have any smoking gun proof that still exists on planet Earth in physical form that this culture left?" And he said yes, but he said to access the Hall of Records, humanity's consciousness must evolve beyond, way beyond where it is today. Because he says you will not be able to pass the guardians who were assigned it until your consciousness reaches this level. Which I interpret as a technology, because other channelers like Dolores Cannon, who wasn't a channeler, she was more of a hypnotic regression therapist. But in a few of her readings, which I don't fully include in the book, but I later discovered where she's regressing some people back. One of her clients was a person who created this like electrostatic consciousness barrier around this temple under the Sphinx. And then when the client was regressed to waking life, she's like, "What did I say? Like, I don't know anything. I don't know anything about Egypt or Giza. What did I say?" And Dolores Cannon was like, "You were one of the record keepers after the third destruction of Atlantis." And it's like, again, that's a weird, like, I mean, Dolores Cannon is a very vetted hypno regression therapist. She didn't just make up shit. Like, she had clients that came to her for healing and stuff, and she created an entire school that people can go to and study this method she used. So when I started seeing that, I was like, I think the guardians, Casey was saying, could have been physical statues, which certain Arabic sources mention that there are actual statues that are like like almost like droids or something that are still kind of latently active. in keeping whoever gets close to this. And I don't have any proof of this. It's
As
just
you
multiple sources have said that there are some sort of guardians, not living, but that there are some sort of things that will not let you get into that hall of records until
right.
you have reached a much higher plane of consciousness where you're not going to use that knowledge for evil.
Stick with me here for a second, but
But I
I'm
don't
gonna.
know.
I love what you
I don't
just
know if it's
said.
like IG-88 from Star Wars, like, you
No, no,
know.
no. I
I
love
don't
what
know
you
what it
just
is.
said. Stick with me. Maybe it's not so much Star Wars or more Indiana Jones. Maybe
Well,
these
there you go.
crystal skulls that have been found around the globe.
Sure.
Some people, actually, a guy I've talked to on the show, Neil Guar, he does this like conference where they bring all the crystal
Mm-hmm.
skulls that are available to a room and
Right.
meditate with them. What if it's a sort of conscious or mental technology that when the collective
Absolutely could be.
consciousness gets to a certain point, these skulls do something that unlocks
No,
it?
and it's actually, I've thought about that. I think, well, Casey was asked, like, what is in this room?
Mm,
And he said a physical record of the beginnings of man's incarnation on earth to the final destruction and the emigration to the Pyrenees Mountains. That was literally what he said in the reading, that it's the real story of humanity. How it was encoded, I don't know. He doesn't say that. The other thing he said was that there's artifacts like tools, musical instruments from Atlantis still there in this room. Um, but you're right. I think it absolutely would have been. And you know, it's funny you said that because in the one Dolores Cannon reading, she actually describes somebody bringing a large crystal to this storehouse
mm.
that was encoded with information. And again, it's like, I think it's funny that some of the most like staunch materialist people, oh, you believe in crystals? It's like, bro, your radio in your car wouldn't work if it didn't have a crystal in it.
It's a
Do you know what I mean?
computer we're
Like, I don't even
using.
think these people understand how technology works. Like, you actually need physical things. Like, a computer is just a collection of minerals that are arranged differently. Like, it's not like a Martian gave it to you as an iPhone. Like, it uses still these things that, you know, we have to dig for, and lithium and this and that. And it's like, yeah, a crystal is a part of transmitting messages. It's always been. So why wouldn't they use a crystal? And why wouldn't they use something that would be universally understood instead of like a proprietary solid state hard drive that you
Well,
couldn't even open in 15,000 years, let's say, you know?
yeah, and I think that's a big reason why people have this suspicion about our world today and whether there have been advanced technologies in the past, because we're living in this digital,
Mm-hmm.
proprietary, patent-based world it's just corrupting itself. It's this planned
Right.
obsolescence of materials where your
Right.
light bulb only lasts 5 months instead of 5 decades like it used to, and it.
And you know, it's so interesting you say that because I was just thinking about this for another conversation I'm having because my specialty, believe it or not, is United States foreign policy. That's what I that's what I actually have my master's degree in, and I was invited to talk about that. But you just reminded me, and it is relevant that that way of thinking, like nobody would build a structure to last that long because, like you said, we don't. You know, we build things with cement that is going to be gone in 150 years in most cases. And similarly, you know, the idea that you could have a peaceful, or at least not perfect, because in Edgar Casey's Atlantis, there are dark factions that are working against the, you know, children of the law of one, but that you could have the persistent, enduring timelines that he says, like that it only blew up 3 times in 90,000 years. Because it's like, how many times have we almost blown up the world in like since we've had nuclear weapons? More than that. You know, how many people have we killed in the 20th century in World War I and World War II? You know, probably more than died in 4,000 years of Atlantean history if you listen to Casey's readings, you
Right.
know, where there were evil people that were analogous to the, say, World Economic Forum or the Nazis today doing weird shit. but that there was an equally powerful, extraordinarily powerful group of kind of sages or Jedi that he describes identically to the Jedi, which I find interesting, who were really good at keeping them kind of at bay,
Right.
you know,
Well,
and that we don't have anything like that really. I mean, we've got, depending on your views, we've got the BRICS nations attempting to say, like, hey, chill out with this endless war hegemony. But there is no kind of enlightened council that we can categorically as a race say, like, oh, those people are good. And you can choose, because it's like, I think the problem with this subject is it's so foreign to us to imagine that we're so jaded in our 20th century, 21st century, that all world leaders are corrupt, all media lies, everything is just bullshit. And I would agree with that for the most part. And that's why shows like this are so important. But that you could actually have like these benevolent technologies where people were living over
yes.
1,000 years, or
Yes.
living in harmony with nature, using clean energy, and again, I'm not one of these, we need to get rid of they're not even fossil fuel, get rid of petroleum. Let me be clear on that, before Rockefeller changed the definition at that meeting. But, this idea that we could potentially live in harmony for long periods of time is so against the grain of the 20 and 21st centuries that I think that's another big hurdle. Like, you mean to tell me that this civilization lasts? It's like, yeah, I mean, why not? Look at Chinese dynasties, how long they've lasted before communism.
Well, and this leads us to, a really, really interesting frontier, and I'm glad you have that optimism, and I do believe in that, especially when I talk to folks like yourself
Mm,
consistently, and I think that's a big reason why people want to listen to these kind of podcasts, because it's uplifting to know that there are alternatives, there are solutions potentially that are not being explored on a official or mainstream level, and believe it
right.
or not, understanding our history helps us not repeat the same mistakes we had in the past. And as
Yeah.
fantastical as it may be to think we can learn about millions and millions of years ago, I think we can. I
Mm,
think that's kind of the um, really important and significant inheritance that we've gotten from our ancestors that speaking for the collective, we might be taking that for granted at this point in time in the 20th and 21st century. I don't know that
I
us as
agree.
individuals do, but as a collective, we certainly seem to be, and that's distressing and definitely pushing more people to learn about this kind of stuff. Now, when it comes
Yeah.
to this faction of Jedi versus maybe
Mm,
the Sith of the Atlantean
yeah.
world. I think
Sons of Belial, as he
right,
called them.
and people in the
Which is interesting
go
itself,
ahead.
that expression, because Belial is the Hebrew derivation of the Phoenician Baal
Hmm.
or the Chaldean Bel, but they all signify wickedness thematically, you know, and many biblical names in Hebrew, like Jezebel,
Well, let me
things like
ask you
this. It's
this.
like Michael, like, I mean, my name is a derivation of who is like that particular Elohim. Jezebel is like, another reference to a Elohim, who Baal was I would argue extraterrestrial or whatever powerful one, as the Bible describes him, who in Edgar Casey's account, this took forever. I really could only find one single time where Edgar Casey identified that Baal or Beelzebub or Bali Lal, as he alternatively calls him, was actually a historical character, but he makes like 100 references to the followers, the acolytes, that he calls the sons of Belial, which is a biblical term. That word appears in the Bible, the sons of Belial, and yeah, they were basically like the Sith. I mean, they had an emperor, they had like a Vader character, they had their stormtroopers, basically. I mean, it wasn't space based, although there are very vague allusions where people asked him. And again, this is in the 30s, before UFOs were even in the public consciousness. So it's quite interesting what he said about that. But he does allude to visitors, from the outer worlds. That's what he describes it. Now, they didn't have a direct, absolute role. I've never made the claim that extraterrestrials dominated and built Atlantis. But just like in documented history, they've visited, they've influenced probably certain races. They've probably helped or harmed the people back then, just like they did now, just like they do now. But it's like, it's still a human story. It's just these humans are so advanced technologically that they might as well be extraterrestrial in some of their abilities.
Now,
Like, I mean, Casey even had this very detailed reading on the power source, this six-sided crystal called the Tuoi stone, which was responsible for the second destruction of Atlantis, that was so powerful that in its malfunction, which it was tuned incorrectly, and it was always the subject of this, like, almost like how the rebels need to get the Death Star plans, to stop it. It existed, but it could be used as a power source. It was neutral. Like, it was just a crystal that absorbed what he called stellar energy and solar energy. And it was this enormous crystal in a dome, an enormous dome that, like a lighthouse, would pull back and gather energy and store it in underground kind of energy substations. And he said it could be used to power the civilization, but it could also be used in this like scalar weapon or directed energy weapon fashion, I guess you would call it. He didn't have the words to use back in the 30s before this technology was rediscovered, I would argue. But at one point, it was accidentally, according to Casey, overtuned, and it fractured the principal, island it was on in the second destruction in the year 28,000 BC. So even that timeline, I mean, that's incredible that we had a technology akin to the Death Star in 28,000 BC, that this idea that everyone on Earth was a hunter-gatherer and a knuckle-dragging, beast from Quest for Fire, it's just not borne by the evidence. And also, it's not to say that, just like today, like we still have cannibals in Papua New Guinea, and then you've got Elon Musk and his rockets. So if you were to take a snapshot of 2021, it's like, do you pick that or do you pick the rockets to say that's the level of tech? It's the same with Atlantis. They had their version of SpaceX and directed energy weapons, and they still had primitive people roaming the earth. It's not like you have to, it's a fallacy in history to kind of oversimplify the past and forget that it would have the same nuance of today. Like, not every son of Belial was incarnately evil. Like, some were kind of just like allured by the temptations of the dark side, and
and it would be
was
like
a political thing. Yeah,
it would be like 100 years
evil,
from now.
Good. It's like, very nuanced. And Casey's story is very nuanced because there's a woman, for example, who asked him, who was I in a past life? And he goes, well, you were this pioneer woman on the Fort Dearborn, where Chicago is today, and your name was May Umbor. And she's like, okay. And he goes, let's just say you got what you wanted from men, from, Indians, from anything. You were a pioneer woman who got what she wanted. And the lady was like, okay, like I was, sleeping with a lot of people. He's like, you just got what you wanted. He was a Christian. And he's like, what May wanted, May got. And then he regresses himself and tells her story as she's listening with the stenographer. He's like, then you were in the times of Rome. And he just casually names extremely uncommon Roman emperors and prelates that lived in reality that actually, I checked, did live at that time. How did he guess that? Then he goes, oh, and by the way, you were a temple priestess in the Children of the Law of One during the second destruction time period, the second version of Atlantis around 29,000 BC, and your name was, Asha or something like that. And he said, in that temple, you weren't really a great person. You were a child of the law of one in the temple of light, but you had 13 different children with 13 different daddies from the sons of Belial. But you were so good at your job that nobody could get rid of you because you were this enlightened priestess, but you still had this dark side tendency. And so his story is the story of how in the Atlantean saga of Casey and Frederick Oliver, who just calls them different names, but it's the same saga. And it's the Star Wars saga. I hate to say this. And it's two possibilities. Lucas read these books and never cited them, which is plagiarism, or they're all conscious, like Jungian collective unconscious
Yeah.
projections of reality, which I actually think is true.
Well,
Because I've
and
never seen George Lucas talk about Edgar Casey or Frederick Oliver's book as a
yeah.
source.
Well, I think it definitely fits into this Joseph Campbell idea that Lucas very much was a fan of. And Campbell was
Right.
somebody who was looking at all of the world's myths and going back to kind of what we were talking about earlier and
Mm-hmm.
what's been on my mind this whole conversation. The world's
Mm.
religions, the post or the antediluvian, diaspora, so to speak.
I would say post. Yeah, I would say the post. I would say all the Abrahamic faiths to me, and I don't mean to insult anybody because I used to be a Catholic and gone through many stages. I don't know, but once I discovered the Atlantean belief system from these channelings, it actually makes so much more sense. And you see how what we call today religion or spirituality are just kind of incomplete. They don't fit quite together because, as Frederick Oliver describes, like you didn't need faith.
Right.
Prove that the sun created reality, civilization. So there was no question when the sun came up that that's as if a thing that all people on earth can look at and agree is real is silly, but you know, spiritual worship is somehow more acceptable. I always found that funny that we all know this. Every culture can see the sun, and we know it gives life to Earth. And we make all those silly sun worshippers. Those silly primitive people. And they would look at us like, "Well, who are you talking to?" Oh, well, I can't see that person, and I don't know, but I definitely don't believe, God. And it's like, so it makes sense because our lost ancient legacy was because at the end of the book, it takes a quite different turn into modern times. And it's like, well, look at all the problems in the world. I'm not saying that, if we all just knew the truth, we'd I mean, that's a fantasy. But knowing that we all come from a kind of much more advanced, sophisticated timeline that through multiple destructions, some man-made, some natural, that was lost. It's like we should then focus instead of on killing each other in division on maybe trying to reclaim that legacy and then enjoy it for as long as we can, because there's no telling what could happen, with a comet or some sort of other event, a failure of technology, nuclear war. And I think we'd realize that particularly in the Western and North American cultures, as you mentioned, like there's a lot more similarity when the Atlantic Ocean wasn't just this gap, when it had these continents, subcontinents, and then finally islands, and that people had the ability to, traverse and travel. It would change the whole idea of race. It would change the idea of who's the real Native American. You know what I mean? Because in Casey's story, there were people from Europe in North America 16,000 years ago, that had a colony in Florida, which was a different landmass at the time. But I mean, it's like when we find these, strange traces, that like you said in the in the Great Lakes region, it's like Gavin Menzies thinks those are Phoenician, which or Minoan, which itself is completely rewrites the Columbus cross the ocean story, because they're at least 1,000 or 2,000 years older than 1500 AD, say roughly. He puts them at like 1,500 BC, some of these mines, and they're not Native American. But what's so crazy is Frederick Oliver says, actually, those are Atlantean mines from the year 11,000 BC.
And it
And again, how was he aware of that?
well, and it seems to be fitting together a little neater if we consider
Right,
that these groups all came from a common area rather than the Europeans were here
right,
before in this
right.
ancient world, right? I think it's just they're doing these mental gymnastics, and I wonder if it's because
Yes.
of the academia, the institutions coming from this worldview that was maintained by empires, which
Mm-hmm.
got their power from the priestcrafts that came
Sure.
from that. So, do you think there's any possibility that these sons of Belial from Atlantis could have existed in some way, secret society type of way, and
Sure.
maintained a control paradigm just enough to keep people ignorant of their true origins?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the kind of classic analog to the sons of Belial in our timeline would be the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, the Jesuits. They form and they function almost identically to how Casey described the sons of Belial functioning. They use charisma, manipulation, coercion, deception to control large groups of people psychologically, while they themselves know the reality. That was a big part of the Casey subplot. It was like the sons of Belial were master propagandists. And in other cases, Casey finally said, because he was giving some of these readings during World War II and during the rise of Hitler. And so many people were asking him questions about that, like, what's going on over there, Mr. Casey? And he actually said that people like Hitler were reincarnations of the sons of Belial back in the 20th century to try it again. And that makes perfect sense, because if reincarnation, which I believe is fairly likely to be true, just logically, it makes sense to me. I've got an argument another time I'll explain. It's quite simple argument, actually, but it would make sense that, like, we're just it's just the same goddamn story. It's like whether it's today or it's in the third destruction, second destruction, it's like as long as we've been on planet Earth as Homo sapiens with this brain capacity, which, by the way, is roughly 300,000 years. So I always ask people, if you think it's crazy, well, mainstream anthropology conservatively places our brain capacity skeletal structure at 250,000 years ago. So there were people as intelligent, probably more intelligent, more physically able than you and me a quarter of a million years ago, with the same earth, the same elements. And you're telling me nothing happened? They sat on their ass for 244,000 years, and then magically, around 4,000, 5,000 BC, they just created law, writing, the pyramids,
Right.
religion, language. It's like,
Well, and even still,
what's that?
and then what accounts for the people in indigenous cultures who, according to academia, haven't done anything, right? It's like,
Right.
it's
Yeah,
this
right.
really weird kind of agrarian centric view of
It is.
biology in a sense. And
It
like,
is.
I don't know how familiar you are with Ivan T. Sanderson, but one of the just kind of
Very
tangents.
familiar.
Oh, okay, cool. One of the things that he was writing about that kind of fits into the Atlantis research I was doing somehow
Mm,
was the work with pygmies and how these
mm,
groups of people were actually more advanced in a sense of evolution than your average
right.
Homo sapien who had not made that technological conscious leap to become immersed in that jungle rainforest environment. And it really
Right.
kind of throws our notions upside down of like what advancement looks like over huge scales of time. What if, you know,
Right.
going the other end of the height spectrum, these giant skeletons that we find in mounds and all over,
Mm,
certain sites, specifically here in America, tons have been
right.
found. What if this represents a sort of big brother species in the chain of
Sure.
events where we kind of are getting smaller over time because there's certain
Yeah.
technological advancements that come with our brains and so forth.
Well, and that's really interesting. And at the end of the book, it's kind of a funny story. I've never told this, and I got about 15 minutes, so maybe we'll end on this. But I used to work as a security guard at a bar in Chicago, and one day I had to fight another philosophy professor. It was really funny, and I beat him up, and I held him down, and he went to prison for attacking my staff. And I later found out, who is this guy? I won't say his name. We have since made up. And I started reading all the books in his class because I had to appear in court to get my money for the shirt he ripped and defend my, takedown legally. And I won the case, with my little public defender, but I had read all the books in his class. And one of the books, he was a professor at a California university, was a book called After Finitude, which was a master or a PhD thesis written by a French who became the chair of philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure, one of the Harvard of France. And it was such an eye-opening book that I had to include it, kind of to justify what you just said, because this philosopher, Quentin Meillassoux, he says the following, and it's really, really difficult book, but I'll summarize it the best I can. It was one of the hardest books I've ever read in my life, and it's like 85 pages. He says, look, we find a fossil, okay, and we say it's 75 million years old because we've radiocarbon dated it. And at 75 million years ago, this is what the world looked like, and this is what the dinosaur probably looked like, and this is what physics was like, and then consciousness emerged. And he presents an argument that even he and nobody to this date could answer because it's so profound, really, what he said. And he said, look, I'm not debating that radiocarbon dating can be accurate and that this indeed probably is 75 million years old. But he goes, what does that mean? Because when you talk about consciousness emerged, let's say with, I don't know, Homo erectus or something like that. Let's just say a million years ago, the first hominid became self-aware. How you would even measure that, I don't know. But he's like, let's just pretend that a million years ago, the first hominid became human-like with the conscious perception. He's like, the whole category that we talk about, the age of the earth, the age of the dinosaurs, he goes, that's a product of the emergence of consciousness. So how can you talk about a categorically different time if that concept itself is the product of the thing it's preceding? Do you follow me? It's like, good
Yeah.
question, bro. I don't know.
Yeah,
And he doesn't either. He's like, this is a problem Kant proposed with his synthesis and, synthetic reason. And, how can you know God if God is ineffable and, reality is filtered through the senses? He uses Kantian logic, but he's like, this is a much bigger problem. Because he's like, I'm not saying that the dinosaurs didn't exist. He's like, but they could have existed in a world that's literally impossible to say anything about with authority. Like, he's like, physics could have been different. There's actually no way to prove that gravity was the same or light was like, there's nothing because there were no observers, allegedly. And he's like, we just take it for granted. Like, we just tell this story like, oh yeah, there's always been like a camera watching everything. And then we came on the scene. And he's like, that's the stupidest thing. And yet nobody in the fucking world, excuse my language, has any kind of problem with thinking that, like, oh, yeah, that's just the way it is. And I was reading that book and I was like, it was worth punching that guy in the face at the bar because I would have never found that, and I would have never included it in the book as the kind of final, like, okay, you don't have to believe Atlantis. But then don't ever tell me what the dinosaurs were doing. In fact, don't tell me anything about anything until you can identify. And it just kind of was a nice kind of final reminder to the reader of the first quote that I opened the book with from Socrates. I know one thing, that I know nothing, which itself is a tautological argument, which at the end of the day, I think everything is. And we just have to look at, well, what logically resonates and where does the evidence kind of point? But will we ever know what the sons of Belial were doing? Probably not. Will we ever really know what people 50 years ago were doing in some boardroom? Probably not. So it's kind of just like a reflection at the end. The book, it's like a trick that this whole time, was this really a book about Atlantis? Or was this actually a mental exercise on how the historical discipline, is quite limited? And by extension, how anything we think is true is itself very likely not as true as you think, and that goes both ways with people that say, I know exactly when Atlantis fell on this Saturday. It's like, okay, maybe, I don't know, maybe not. But it's just as stupid to say that this is all make believe, because as we just talked about, there's a preponderance of very good evidence, So that's all I got, For more information, you can read, the book.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Bravo. Well said. And I love that point to end on, especially on a show like this where people are seeking conclusions. They realize that the world is not what they've been told. Their whole world gets turned upside down. And I think what really needs to happen is we need to get comfortable with that Socratean knowing that we don't know. And,
that's right.
And yeah,
I couldn't think of a better way to wrap it up, and I think if I had one thing to tell people, it would be, whether you're an educator, a student, or anything, that the dumbest people, well, I shouldn't even say the dumbest. Much more poetically said than me, and W.B. Yeats, The Second Coming, the worst are full of fiery passion and the best lack all conviction. And I absolutely believe that the people speaking the loudest and the people that are the most certain, be very careful, be very careful with anything I've said today with certainty. I've tried not to say anything with certainty. This is just what I've found. But certainly on both sides, for or against any argument, I think the best you can do is have a civil, polite discussion. You tell me what you think. I learned something. I tell you what I think and have found through my research. And we arrive at some synthesis and it moves along to the next thing, But right. That's actually not at all how people go to school. That's not how you graduate. That's not how you get the grades. And that's not how you move up in a company. We're rewarded for certainty, even if it means lying, And I think that's why it's so difficult for people to even question the simplest things, like the media is lying to you, No, they would never do that. It's like, okay, well, here's this, that. No. And so for those people, you just have to go, like, I don't know, man. I don't know what to tell you.
Right. Some people are more comfortable in that certainty until they realize that nothing's certain, but one thing's for
Right.
sure, you have written an excellent book that I would love to have you back on to continue talking about, because we just scratched the surface. The title is
Yeah.
Visions of Atlantis: Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy, and
Yes,
the book is
indeed.
available on Amazon. You can get it in a bunch of
Yes, it
different
is.
versions, and yeah, do you have a website or anything else you'd like to promote before we get going here?
Yeah, I do. I have a website. It's just my name, Michael de Flem, with the last name together, at michaeldeflem.com. And it's got some links to some of the sources I cite, some other articles about Atlantis, reading lists. And if you want to contact me, that's the best way. There's a contact form. And I'm always interested, and I always get interesting letters and emails from just the strangest people, like from all over the world. Like I've been looking for that answer for 27 years, and I've never seen it explained the way. And thank you. And it's like it's very nice, because when you're doing anything like this for so long and putting so much time and energy into it, you never know. Is this just going to be a flop? Is this going to get flack? Is this going to be a hit? And um, as a self-published author, you have no help. You've got to promote, and I had to do the editing, the cover format. I had to learn how to format a book, put the pictures, get the copyright, pay this person, and you wonder, like, are you crazy? Like, is this even going to be worth it? And then, like I said, to my great surprise, probably halfway, 5, 6 months in, it became the number one bestseller in the world in prehistory. And with luck, um, I submitted it to Graham Hancock's Book of the Month Club. So maybe I get a shout out from the man, who was a real inspiration and mentor for so many in this field, and
Yeah.
so wildly misrepresented. And I think it's jealousy more than anything, because he was really one of the first. And without him, there would probably be none of this kind of, study. He really popularized this 30 years ago. And he's a great scholar. And I have a tremendous respect for him and the people that came before him, like Congressman Ignatius Donnelly, friend of Abraham Lincoln, not a, lightweight, he's a heavyweight politician who dedicated his life to finding evidence of Atlantis at the end of his life. It's like, these are interesting people. And I think of, this book as an homage to the greats, and a kind of, if you're an expert, there's definitely going to be something you haven't seen. If you've only looked at clairvoyant evidence, there's plenty of other evidence. And if you're somebody that has absolutely no idea about what the hell we've been talking about, it's still written in a way that doesn't presume you know anything and takes you through the whole big picture. So
Hmm.
that's all I got.
No, yeah,
And
I second that. It's a great
I
read.
appreciate it. Thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity. And sure, I'd love to come back and we could talk about some more evidence based, like a legal case for the legal case for Atlantis, with some
Cool.
real interesting pictures and charts that I think even the most skeptical would find very difficult to deny.
Yeah,
So thank you so much.
absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you. The pleasure's mine. You do great work, so I'd love to host you a second time, and we could get into the photographs. We could get into even some of
Mm,
the maps and charts. I think the Theosophical
mm,
Society put that one together.
yeah,
It's in the book, but
that's a weird map. Yeah.
right, right. So much more to talk about. I look forward to it, and until next time,
Thank
folks,
you.
go and support Michael LaFlemme. The website is linked in the description. Pick up the book, and we'll see you next time. Immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now.